Creepypastas, a term I really shouldn't have to explain to you if you're familiar with the horror genre. Whether it be the recently popular Sonic.exe, the infamous Jeff the Killer and his clones, or the actually good ones like the Russian sleep experiment, creepypastas are an iconic part of internet culture, and the horror genre as a whole. Little ways for people to express their custom-made urban legends and tales most certainly gave birth to many iconic figures. However, there was always one specific character that stood above the rest. One that sparked tons of fan content and it even got so popular it got its own movie. The iconic character being Slender Man. This terrifying persona immediately became iconic due to a variety of reasons, and thus spawned tons of fan content. One of the most notable examples being the games. Now, creepypasta games are nothing unique to Slender Man. But that doesn't stop Slender Man from having what I think to be the best creepypasta game out there. That game being Slender the Arrival. When I first heard that this game was getting an update, I immediately decided to hop on to get an idea of what it was before its soon to be said update. And while I came into this game with good expectations, I wasn't expecting too much other than the campy Slender style gameplay, with maybe some added story elements. However, this game did a wonderful job at exceeding the said expectations of mine, to the degree of leaving me astonished. And while I think nearly all the game is great, there are three key chapters, the way the game divides its sections, that truly stood out to me. Now, with that being said, let's get on with it. And let me tell you why I think Slender the Arrival is the best creepypasta horror game to date. The first of these three chapters I wish to talk about is certainly the most unexpected out of the three, which makes sense given the fact that it is indeed the prologue. And while this chapter may not have much in terms of gameplay, playing it always sends a unique chill down my spine. Both the game and this chapter start off with us getting out of our car, with a path guiding us over to our destination. The environment seems very calming and peaceful as we begin our descent down the hill. The credits start rolling for the game, and all seems fine until we hear a few rustling of leaves that tell us we're not alone. In fact, quite the contrary. Hearing this, we become more anxious as we continue our descent down the hill, constantly hearing the rustling of leaves behind us as the clouds start to block the sun, allowing for a more dark environment to settle in as we reach our destination, which just so happens to be a house. When I saw this house for the first time, I quickly dashed towards it, fearing for what's to come if I didn't immediately enter the household. After we enter the house and close the door behind us, we are greeted to the living room, and with it, many disturbing scrawls on the white walls, depicting the ever iconic Slenderman in the forests he roams in. Going into this house, praying that we will be safe from whatever is outside, only to be met with these disturbing drawings, adds heavily to the unnerving tone that the game has set up to this point. These drawings only act as a way to let the player know that something is wrong, however, forcing us to take note of all the irregularities, all the scattered notes, misplaced furniture, it all just feels off. This feeling is soon heightened and slightly changed as we eventually make our way and enter Kate's room. The scrolls from the living room now decorating each and every wall from floor to ceiling, as music comes in to fill the void, emphasizing that there isn't just something off about this place. In fact, there is something wrong. After a scream is heard and we begrudgingly make our way over to investigate it, the game switches from its unnerving tone to a constant tension builder. The game then forces us down a path, one that is very similar to the one at the beginning of the chapter, allowing us to flip generators on, which allow us to both see further down the path and areas that aren't connected to it. As we head further down the path and the surrounding disconnected areas, we are occasionally accompanied by the rustling of leaves from earlier, and, of course, the iconic static of Slenderman. So yeah, after recording these audios, I then realized that Slenderman does in fact come up along with these static images. It still makes for a terrifying moment either way, but yeah, so don't call me out. Don't do it. This might not seem much, but the way each one is followed only made me even more anxious. With each and every time I flipped on a generator, I always felt like I was gaining the attention of something, an inherited fear as I already knew I wasn't alone, due to the now more common rustling of leaves from earlier. The tension created by these noises only were released in reaction to the statics of Slenderman, which the game capitalizes on their iconic nature. Whenever this static would appear, I would always have the inherited fear that Slenderman is coming for me, and while this was never the case in this chapter, each passing one only built up more tension because I knew at one point the static wouldn't be bluffing. And while the static never had any consequences, as I said in this chapter, it sure did in the later ones, allowing all that built up fear from the static to be all the much more effective in the later chapters. Although this might not seem like much since it is just tension building, keep in mind that it still can reach into phenomenal horror, such as this. While Homestead is the latest of the chapters I will be talking in this video, I do find that I have less to talk about Homestead than I do about the other entry. That being said, however, Homestead still manages to create a phenomenal experience. Homestead is one of the two tapes that you can find in the chapter Memories. Putting it in allows us to play Homestead, and we are greeted to the distorted voice of CR, along with a desolate farm.
The date is September 19th. My name is CR, on site of the Matheson family farm, continuing my investigation in Charlie's disappearance. Let's see what we can turn up.
This immediately starts to set in the unnerving tone that will be ever iconic throughout this chapter. The structures being ruined as you walk inside them, feeling the decay of each place you go in. While it isn't as direct as Kate's house, it does give off a very uncanny feeling. These weren't suddenly abandoned. These were the result of multiple problems. This, along with the distorted voice of CR, adding a very uncanny element, makes the player feel unsafe. The more we explore, the more we get to take in our surroundings. The places are definitely quiet, despite all the sounds from the landscape around us. Eventually, we begrudgingly head towards a cellar, if you're like me, who tried every other option, which just so happened to be locked. Heading into the cellar has the same feeling as with the prologue, with a bright and urban place soon crossing over into a more dreadful and tense one. Going into the cellar, we don't immediately expect things to be easy. The place seems like a maze, and we can even see a creature we assume we have to flee from right in front of us. As the tension builds, we somber over to the creature, ready to run away just for the lights to flicker off and the creature disappearing. We then suspect that this creature is probably just a hallucination, meant to give us some cheap jump scares. However, when we eventually return back to the surface with the key item in hand, we get this lovely little scene. In my eyes, this scene is so fantastically brilliant. With the creature running around, seemingly out of the blue, and running towards us, we have nothing to do but run. We have no idea what the path the creature has, what its mechanics are, or how to even defend ourselves. All we know is that we've angered it, and it's now coming to rip our face off. And backing it up, the once uncanny setting of the day lit farm quickly becomes a setting of nightmare fuel, as the game has already convinced us to relate danger with darkness, and this only escalates later on. Now, after you escape the proxy and make your way over to the building you can before, you are met with a charred, burnt, desolate house. As we stand here, looking at this husk of a house, this corpse of an adobe, the uncanny feeling from before nearly all gets washed away as we look at the aftermath of whatever happened to the people that used to live here. The deafening abandonment of this area turns into something that reeks of quiet tension, the horror quickly turning to sorrow as we see what happens to Slenderman's victims. We then begin to think about what kind of events could have led to this. What kind of insanity could have befell these people, these poor people that were forced to burn their own house and seemingly themselves. However, nonetheless, we still continue on. Going through the car maze, the proxy chase begins again. However, it is still just as terrifying, if not even more so as the time before. The proxy seems to not only run faster now, but more frequent and more direct to your location. And then we arrive at the church, going past all the gravestones, letting the environmental terror and sorrow for these people sink in. As the same feeling from the house comes back here, we eventually enter the church. We hear the door slam shut behind us, and instinct takes over us as we immediately look back to see what happened, to only be met with the terror himself, Slenderman. We then wait for what seems like minutes as Slenderman stands there, but soon disappears, leaving us with nothing, as we then soon find out that we are trapped. And soon enough, the following events play out. I can't even begin to explain how good this is in terms of horror. It's so wonderfully done in such a simple way by using the limitations of the player to make a wonderful, small, intense moment. And the best part about this is that it isn't even over. When it comes to these kinds of sequences, many horror games either haven't done them or have tried and failed. However, Slender the Arrival has done it perfectly. Starting off, the build-up of this is wonderfully done. By having the process gets progressively more dangerous as time goes on, it builds up such a fantastic climax. From the cellar to the cornfields to now, the tension has always been heightened, and to have this monster suddenly directly chasing us down is an experience that terrified me. Not only that, but the way the proxy sounds. The sounds of a wild beast, completely feral, as it chases us down and after we eventually trap it, is something completely horrifying. Hearing the sounds of something that you know can turn you into fertilizer, desperately trying to get out and breaking down the door is a moment full of anticipation as you anxiously try and escape it. Not to mention that the ending scene, for being a chase area with adjustable pacing due to the fact that the player can take as fast or as slow as they want, never ceases to have the wrong pacing somehow. Going straight into the trapdoor allows a terrifying feeling as the proxy continues the chase very close to the time we heard it break out, allowing the tension to suddenly continue. However, if we instead don't immediately go into the trapdoor, we just wait upstairs, full of anticipation for the proxy to come up and chase us, until we eventually dive down into the trapdoor and get an entirely new jump scare, followed by an entirely new chase scene. Undoubtedly, this was a extremely good chapter of this game. The threat that slowly builds up until it was chasing us down ferociously, but then again, the chases can be kind of easy. After all, this chapter does focus a lot on storytelling and how the environment is supposed to scare you, and not outright jump scares and vicious mechanics. So there is no overbearing threat. The same, however, cannot be said for Into the Abyss. Oh boy, where do I even start with this chapter? This one chapter is undoubtedly my favorite out of the bunch, which makes sense given a variety of reasons, including the fact that it has an overarching threat, one that isn't binded to chase scenes or plain jump scares. Into the Abyss might not be as terrifying storytelling wise and environmental design as something like Homestead, but its gameplay and how it connects to its fear makes for the most terrifying version of hide and seek I have ever seen or played. However, before we get into the gameplay, I feel like I wouldn't be doing this in chapter entirely justice if I didn't talk about what happens before we enter the madness. We start off by waking up in a grassland, presumably where the previous chapter, the 8 pages, left us off. We then walk around encountering barren structures with notes on them, the chirping of birds accompanying us as we make our way throughout the landscape. Soon enough, we come face to face to the abyssally dark mining facility, with its gaping entrance enticing us to come into its void. And of course, we then exit the peaceful, unsettling grasslands and enter the dark, dreadful, and terrifying mining facility. As we make our way through the tunnel of this mining facility, we get to take in how abandoned this place is. All the lights have been shut down, and obstacles and parts, containers have been just spread around, and the entire area emanates panic, as the only way to see where we're going is with our faint little flashlight. Something went wrong here, and now anything could be here. And even though it's probably just our old pal Slenderman, we still fear whatever is out there. We then soon make our way in and realize that we need to find several generators to power the lift. And oh boy, remember when I was afraid of whatever the generators could draw to me? Yeah, the echoing doesn't help. We then begin our pursuit to these generators. We know that it isn't going to be easy, so every step is filled with nervous and tension, but we manage to find one or two generators and turn them on. But soon enough, we inevitably decide to walk on the bridge, not knowing what is waiting for us. And soon enough, we then realize the actual danger of this chapter. And this is when things finally start to begin. At first, Kate might seem like a boring, lazy old enemy with the same look at them mechanic, but there is so much more to it that makes Kate so unique. From the maps to her mechanic itself, she is vastly different. The main difference that separates Kate from other similar enemies of her type is the fact that there's a more difficult process behind keeping her at bay. One that forces you to lower your field of view as you narrow in your flashlight and directly look at Kate. Do this every time we go around a corner. It feels more stressful, as we don't know if we will be able to react fast enough or if Kate is even there. The fact that we have to be precise with the mechanic makes things way more stressful, as it's way easier to get jump scared by Kate while walking around corners. The devs seemingly also knew this, putting multiple entrances to one hallway, which adds more corners and more ways to be stuck on, which is another big thing to Kate. Along with corners, the maze-like structure of the map makes us more terrified of being snuck up on. This fear is even furthered when we hear the sounds that Kate makes, her gnarls and footsteps putting us on edge as we know she's hunting us. We have to double check every corner to make sure we are safe. Many times I have found myself immediately stopping to try and hear where she was coming from after I heard said sounds, looking at every entrance to make sure that I was okay and it was safe to turn my back. Many times I have felt as if I was taking risks by furthering my approach. Along with this, we are extremely cautious about every step we take, not wanting to bump into her and attract attention to ourselves. And I was most certainly cautious, and waiting or not, I still had my fair share of run-ins with Kate, which felt like a new fear entirely. When you finally catch line of sight of Kate and stop her approach, the music switches from a disturbing track to one that is extremely menacing, the new tune adding a new feel of uncanniness as it drilled into my head, making me on edge every single time I heard it. The run-ins with Kate forced me to stare her down, the looping melody making me shiver and cringe as the melody continued. Listening to this while I was forced to stare at her, trying to choose my next move, is so infinitely uncanny for a situation that's already horrifying. However, we aren't even done yet with the list of problems. Yep, you saw that right. Slenderman is still here, and while he may not be the main antagonist in this chapter, he is still very, very menacing to deal with. While he has lost a lot of his extra ways to kill the player, most of them being seen in the 8 pages, the previous chapter, and now instead relies on his iconic teleporting and proximity, his old ways work in such fantastic tangent with both the map and Kate, making him even more menacing than the other chapters. The main way of why he works so well in this section is how much more confined the mining rig is than the woods. The mining facility's maze-like structure makes escaping Slenderman way more complicated than the woods, which makes sense given its narrow patterns. But it also adds a new level of panic as the player is usually forced to either turn around and run or just wait there. The new danger that Slenderman possesses makes the company of his static go from frightening but so predictable to something downright horrifying in most cases, mostly due to K already being on the player's mind. Slenderman's mechanics, while being watered down, complement Kate in such a fantastic way that both manage to be extremely horrifying and appeal to Slenderman's personality as a whole. You see, Slenderman's mechanics have always felt best when it felt like he was toying with the player, blocking off certain points and making things more unpleasant as they try and look for the pieces they need. And while he still does accomplish that alone in this chapter, with Kate it becomes something far greater. The way the player can get so easily sandwiched between Slenderman and Kate truly feels both mockerish to waste your time, but also causes an adrenaline rush, as Kate inches closer in every turn to check if Slenderman is still there, adding only more time for Kate to close in. Slenderman also works well when Kate is in her idle status, causing you to worry about if she's approaching behind you or is in the same line of sight as Slenderman. Even the pure existence of having a main antagonist, something you have to look at, with Slenderman, a character you can't look at, feels entirely mockerish, and definitely the way that Slenderman should be portrayed. However, there is still one more situation that both stays true to Slenderman's personality and is the most terrifying, at least in my opinion. That situation being is when I'm already being chased by Kate, but Slenderman forces me to retreat back to where I was running from, to where Kate is, where she will come and attack me. Going back through the path I used to escape Kate is incredibly anxious due to all the corners, making it so any turn could lead to my death. Whenever I would turn the corner while this was happening, every time I looked around, I always would feel and think to myself that she would be there, right to attack me, and I might not be able to react fast enough. Slenderman isn't here to try and kill you quickly. He is here to play with you, to toy with you, giving Kate more terrifying potential as we are forced into different situations with her. An indirect character combining with a direct character causes for such confusion and such multitasking that the player has to take time to list out their options whenever each situation occurs. Time we almost most certainly will not have. Slender the Arrival is a great game by itself, hands down. So much so that it's become my favorite creepypasta game to date, and one of my favorite horror games to this date. The horror in it is phenomenal, down to the environment, mechanics, and even the designs. If I wasn't being scared, unnerved, etc., I often would feel something else that is positive about this game. And even though I didn't touch on any of the non-horror elements, the game still holds up as just being a great game. One with tons of care put into it. Its story is also great, even though I didn't go in it, it's still amazing. I could go on and on about how good this game was. I'm sorry if I didn't cover your favorite chapter of this game, but trust me, they are all amazing. I'm so happy you could turn into this pretty long video and my first ever. I hope that you enjoyed, and I will see you guys in the next video.